trouble came without warning, loud and unashamed, as a group of white men swarmed a black couple's car at a rural Georgia gas station, shouting slurs and pounding on the windows. Imani Kane stepped in, steady and fearless, her brother Marcus just behind her, quiet, watchful, and quickly dismissed. The gang backed off, but not far. That night, they returned with more men and worse intentions. A brutal street fight erupted, and in the chaos, a gun was drawn. Imani was shot and died in Marcus's arms. What the men didn't know, what they never imagined, was that her brother was Delta Force. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. A black Delta Force commander is home visiting his sister for the first time in nearly 4 years, though to Marcus Kane, it doesn't feel like a homecoming so much as a mission where no one gave him a proper briefing. The familiar streets, with their cracked sidewalks and leaning telephone poles, are supposed to offer comfort, but instead they feel foreign, as though some quiet shift has occurred in his absence, like the soul of the town has tilted just slightly, in a way he can't yet define. He steps off the Greyhound bus with the same posture he held stepping out of an armored convoy, tall, alert, shoulders back, eyes scanning his environment not for threats, but out of habit. The southern sun beats down from above, filtered through clouds the color of ash and milk, casting a faint silver sheen over Lockridge, Georgia, a town suspended somewhere between history and hesitation. Children dart between parked cars and mailboxes in the distance, laughter echoing faintly from a neighborhood Marcus once tore through on a BMX bike when he still had scraped knees instead of shrapnel scars. He sees a porch swing he helped repair with his father when he was 12. The familiar creak it gives in the wind makes his chest tighten unexpectedly. His duffel bag is slung over his shoulder, worn with use and dust from half a dozen countries that would never show up in tourist brochures. The smell of fried catfish from a roadside shack tickles his memory, but nothing tastes the same anymore. Not food, not peace, not even the feeling of standing still. A dented, rust-touched sedan rolls up slowly, and behind the wheel sits Imani Kane, grinning at him as though she might explode if she holds it back any longer. Her smile is the same as always, radiant, unbothered, infused with a kind of kindness that years of community work and late-night lesson planning had only deepened. She steps out before he can open the door himself and throws her arms around him, nearly knocking the bag from his shoulder. For a brief second, he lets his arms tighten around her in return, rests his cheek against her hair, and closes his eyes. Not because he's tired, but because it's the only moment in the past year that's felt real. "Marcus Elijah Kane," she says, pulling back with mock scolding. "Look at you. You're built like a freight train and frown like you've got classified information on your cereal box." He lets out something that resembles a chuckle. "It's good to see you, too. You look good. I mean, you look intense, but good. Come on, get in the car before someone mistakes you for an escaped convict." She pops the trunk, and he tosses his duffel in, then climbs into the passenger seat. The interior smells faintly of vanilla and old notebooks, and a hand-drawn thank you card from one of her third graders dangles from the rearview mirror on a string. They pull off the curb and onto the main road. "Still driving this piece of junk?" he asks, half smiling. "She's got character," Imani replies, "and great gas mileage, which I'm sure the Pentagon doesn't care about, but teachers do." They ride in silence for a moment, not an uncomfortable one, but full of quiet observations. Marcus watches the storefronts blur past, hardware stores with missing letters on their signs, an old diner with crooked blinds, the elementary school where he used to play four-square, and now she teaches math and moral courage. "I saw your photo on the wall in the school hallway," he says, finally breaking the silence. Teacher of the year. Imani shrugs, but her smile betrays the pride she tries to hide. That was 2 years ago. Last year I just got a certificate that said, "Nice job." I'm proud of you, Marcus says. She doesn't respond immediately, just gives his hand a quick squeeze. And I'm proud of you for surviving. They pull into the driveway of the old Kane family home, still standing strong with its cracked bricks, green shutters faded from decades of sun, and a porch swing Marcus swears hasn't moved an inch since their father died. As they unload the trunk, a neighbor across the street, a white man in his 60s wearing suspenders and holding a gardening hose, pauses to stare. His eyes linger, suspicious and flat. Imani waves. The man doesn't wave back. Marcus watches the man return to watering the same patch of grass for far too long. "Friendly place," he murmurs. Imani rolls her eyes. You'd think after 20 years they'd stop pretending they've never seen a black face on this block. But they don't say anything, because they know I'll say something back. Later, after dinner and laughter, and recounting old stories about falling off bikes and sneaking out to late-night cookouts, Marcus agrees to a walk around the neighborhood. It's dusk now, that magic hour where the heat backs off and the shadows start to stretch like fingers, brushing against houses and alleys. They walk slow, the way only people who aren't in a hurry do, comfortable in silence, occasionally breaking it to comment on changes to the neighborhood. They pass a mailbox painted like a bulldog, a tree still bent from the last hurricane, and the old corner store with the neon sign that still reads "Cold Beer," even though it hasn't sold anything colder than room temperature in 10 years. As they round the corner onto Jefferson Avenue, they see Hanson's Gas, its flickering lights spilling across the pavement in weak yellow streaks. And then they see the scene unfolding just beyond the pumps. A rusted-out Corolla sits parked with the engine still running, windows up, and inside, a young black couple, both visibly shaken, clutching each other tightly. Surrounding the car are 6 white men, mostly in their 20s or early 30s, dressed in a mixture of camouflage jackets and worn denim, stomping around the vehicle like it's prey. One of them has a beer can dangling from his fingers. Another slaps the hood hard enough to make the woman inside flinch. A third man, tall, greasy, wearing a backward camo cap, leans in, shouting something Marcus can't hear yet, but the posture, the expression, the menace, it's universal. Imani stops walking. Marcus's body tenses before he's even aware of it. The old instinct kicks in. Peripheral awareness sharpens. Heartbeat stays steady. He notes each man's position, height, reach, the way the youngest of the group, Benny Slade, skinny and jumpy, hovers on the edge, like he wants to disappear. "This isn't right," Imani says quietly, already stepping forward. Marcus reaches for her arm, voice low but tight. "Don't!" But she's already walking. And the air, warm as it is, seems to drop 10 degrees as they cross the threshold of the lot, walking toward something that feels inevitable. Imani Kane crossed the gas station lot with steady, purposeful strides, her voice sharp and cutting through the humid dusk like a blade honed on principle. "That's enough," she called, her words clear, unwavering, and loud enough to punch through the crude laughter and echo off the concrete awnings. "Back away from that car. Right now." The 6 men froze for a half-beat, surprised, maybe, that anyone had the nerve to interrupt them. Then, slowly, a few turned to face her. One, squat and broad, with a faded skull tattoo on his neck, snorted as if the interruption amused him. Another leaned against the back of the car, arms crossed over a stained tank top, chewing on a toothpick with mock indifference. And then there was the one with the goatee, tall, greasy-haired, and walking with the self-importance of someone who believed the weight on his belt loop granted him authority. He smiled wide, but there was no humor in it. "Well, look at that," he drawled, voice coated in that familiar southern twang that always seemed friendlier than the poison it carried. "Ain't that sweet?" The local welcome committee finally showed up. Imani didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't soften her tone. "This isn't a game. You're threatening two innocent people. Back away, or I'll make sure this whole entire town sees you for exactly what you are." The man laughed. Not loud, not genuine, but enough to let the others know the show would go on. "Oh, we're just talking. Maybe they took a wrong turn. Can't have strangers loitering, can we?" From the car, the black couple inside remained motionless, their expressions frozen in a cocktail of panic and disbelief. The young man in the driver's seat kept both hands visible on the wheel, his eyes darting between the figures outside. The woman beside him pressed her palm to the window, as if searching for something solid, some invisible shield to hold the danger back. Behind Imani, Marcus stepped forward at last, his presence less an entrance and more a shift in gravity. He didn't say a word as he walked up beside his sister, but the transformation was immediate. The air around him tightened, the men's posturing faltered, and even the goatee man's smile dipped slightly. There was something in Marcus's eyes, not loud, not wild, but still and cold, like a tide pulling back before a storm surge. The kind of stare that came from years of operating in environments where hesitation meant death. Marcus's voice, when it came, was low and firm. "You had your moment. It's over. Back off and walk away." Goatee man squinted, not quite willing to blink first. "You military?" Marcus didn't answer. "You got that look," the man continued. "That stiff-necked, quiet killer thing. I bet you think you're real tough." Marcus took a single step closer, his body language calm, measured, but unmistakably poised. "You don't want to find out." A few of the men were shifting now, less sure. Benny Slade, younger than the rest and already sweating through his flannel shirt, looked back toward the parked pickup trucks behind the station. His foot tapped the ground involuntarily, his body betraying nerves he couldn't hide. Another man muttered under his breath, something about hero types always poking their noses in places they don't belong. The man with the skull tattoo turned away from the car, muttering curses as he began moving off. The domino effect started from there. Two more stepped back, shoulders lowered, eyes avoiding contact. It was Goatee who held on the longest, pride thick in his stance, even as the rest of his pack started retreating. He took one last look at Imani, as if trying to decide whether to spit a final insult or just accept defeat. Then his gaze settled back on Marcus. "You think this is done? This ain't over," he said, the words bitter and heavy. Marcus didn't move. "Then you should leave while it still can be." The goatee man turned and walked off, slowly, deliberately, his boots loud against the pavement. Benny lingered for a second longer, casting a glance over his shoulder at the black couple in the car, something between shame and confusion flickering across his face, before jogging to catch up with the others. As the trucks rumbled to life in the alley and pulled away, the lot settled into an uneasy quiet. The tension didn't lift so much as it deflated, sagging like a balloon let go mid-air. Still floating, still present, but no longer fully in control of the moment. The young man in the Corolla cracked his window just enough to be heard. His voice, hoarse and breathless, trembled. "Thank you. Thank you both." Imani nodded, her own breath a little unsteady now that the immediate danger had passed. "Be safe." "Get out of here!" The car pulled away quickly, tires chirping as they left the lot behind. Marcus watched them go, his jaw tight, eyes still scanning the shadows, as if expecting the danger to double back immediately. He turned toward Imani, who had crossed her arms, one hand rubbing her shoulder absently. "You shouldn't have stepped in like that," he said, his voice even but edged with something he hadn't shown during the confrontation. Not anger, concern. And let them scare those kids into silence? You know I couldn't. She met his gaze. You came, didn't you? I came because you did. Well, then, I guess we're both reckless, she said, offering the faintest smile. Marcus looked down the street, watching the horizon where the trucks had vanished. He knew the look of men who backed off because they were outmatched, not because they were finished. What they'd seen here tonight wouldn't be the end of it. Not with men like that. He had seen their type overseas, those who couldn't handle humiliation, who nursed pride like a festering wound, and who didn't forget the sting of being made to walk away. They'll be back, Marcus said quietly. Imani's smile faded, and she nodded once. I know. They turned back toward home, walking in silence. The sun was gone now, swallowed by the horizon, and the streetlights flickered on, buzzing like hornets overhead. Behind them, near the back of the station, an engine idled briefly, headlights flickering once before vanishing into the dark. The peace they thought they'd earned was already unraveling. The air had cooled just slightly since their confrontation at the gas station, but the tension hadn't. If anything, it clung tighter, the way sweat does in the thick Georgia air after the sun disappears but refuses to take the heat with it. Marcus and Imani walked side by side down a narrow residential street, the rhythmic thud of their steps softened by uneven asphalt and scattered leaves. Porch lights blinked on one by one, casting a faint golden glow across empty driveways and quiet stoops. But no one sat outside. No one waved. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel like peace, more like a warning, still and loaded. Imani pulled her arms around herself, though not out of fear. She did it more like someone shielding herself from the weight of invisible eyes, from the feeling that something in the dark behind them had not yet released its grip. Her voice came soft, thoughtful, not quite fragile but close to it, when she finally broke the silence. They didn't even see us as people, she said, not needing to clarify who she meant. Just targets or noise, something in the way. Marcus didn't respond immediately. His attention was scanning their surroundings, slow, subtle, precise. Not because he expected a fight right this second, but because some part of him, the part trained to survive ambushes in places where people hid death under floorboards and in fruit baskets, had already sensed the shift. Something was off. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the kind of stillness that happened after something was set in motion, but hadn't yet landed. They saw us just fine, he replied eventually, his tone neither dismissive nor kind. That's what scared them. The road narrowed as they walked, fences drawing closer to the curb, streetlights dimming until the gaps between pools of light seemed to stretch longer than they should. Houses passed by in slow motion, each one quietly shut up behind curtains and drawn blinds. Marcus kept walking with his eyes forward, but his attention fanned out like a radar sweep, catching every flicker of motion, every murmur of sound beyond the threshold of the ordinary. Imani glanced sideways at him, her brow furrowed, her voice quieter still. You feel it too, don't you? He didn't need to answer. The weight in his eyes told her everything. Then, from around the next corner, a sudden engine roar cracked the quiet. The jarring, throat-deep rev of a diesel truck peeled out from an intersecting street behind them, tires growling across pavement as it tore into view. A second engine answered it, then a third. Marcus stopped walking. Imani did the same, her shoulders tensing as headlights swept over them. The first truck screeched to a stop at the far end of the street, angled just enough to block their exit without fully trapping them. Another truck rumbled to a halt behind them, the engine left idling with an almost deliberate, menacing calm. Doors didn't open immediately. The silence returned, but this time it had claws. And then it broke. From the edges of the street, from behind hedges and the shadows of trees, men stepped out. One by one, they emerged without hurry, without masks, without fear. Not the kind of chaos you see in panicked mobs. This was something colder. Planned. Vindictive. 8, 10, maybe more. Some carried bats or pipes, others only fists, and the kind of expressions that promised they wouldn't stop swinging until their hands bled. Among them, Marcus recognized faces. The man with the goatee, front and center again, smiling like a man who believed violence made him holy. Benny Slade followed close behind him, his face pale and uncertain, but still present, still complicit. Marcus stepped forward without a word, placing himself between Imani and the encroaching men, as though his body alone could hold them back. His hands stayed at his sides, relaxed but ready, and he scanned the group the way a wolf studies a pack it intends to tear apart. Methodical, without fear, but calculating all the same. The goatee man smiled wider, eyes alight with something unhinged. "You thought that little stunt at the gas station meant you got to walk away?" he said, voice slick with that same cruel charm he'd used earlier. "You made us look weak. You made us look like we take orders from—" He stopped himself just before the word, letting it hang in the air like rot. "People like you. You made yourselves look weak," Marcus said evenly, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable timbre of command. "All we did was shine a light." "Then let's see what happens in the dark," the man hissed. The first blow came from the left, a wild swing with a rusted crowbar aimed at Marcus's head. He ducked it cleanly, using the attacker's momentum to slam his elbow backward into the man's ribs, then pivoting with brutal grace to catch another charging figure with a straight punch that landed like a hammer to the throat. The man collapsed without a sound, but there were too many of them. From behind, another pair lunged forward, trying to pin Marcus's arms. He twisted out, using one man as a shield, flinging him forward into the others. Fists swung wildly in the dark, missing Marcus by inches, but forcing him to shift constantly, reading their movements in real time, adapting, countering, dismantling. They weren't trained. They had no formation, no structure, only rage, fear, and ignorance, but their numbers made them dangerous. Marcus fought like water under pressure, each movement clean, each counterstrike efficient, every breath controlled as he snapped joints, dropped knees into guts, and broke noses with his forearms. His knuckles split open by the fifth attacker. His forearm was bruised and bleeding by the seventh. He didn't stop. Imani, no longer behind him but now off to the side, had picked up a broken tree branch from the ground and used it with more ferocity than Marcus had ever seen in her. She slammed it into the back of one man's knee, then turned and cracked it across the side of another's face as he reached for her jacket. She didn't scream, didn't cry out. Her jaw clenched, eyes wide and focused, not wild, but righteous. And still, they came. One of them shouted slurs between breaths, each word spat like venom, trying to sting what their fists couldn't break. Another laughed as he lunged at Marcus with a knife that caught nothing but air as Marcus sidestepped and brought his boot down on the man's wrist with a crunch that ended the fight for him. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting because hate had demanded blood, and they were too far gone to back out now. But the chaos wasn't done gathering. Just beyond the edge of the melee, a figure moved through the shadows, calmer than the rest, more deliberate. He didn't shout. He didn't swing. He watched, and in his hand he held something glinting beneath his coat. The fight had turned into something primal, something without rhythm or pattern, just impact and instinct and survival played out under flickering streetlights and the deep hum of idling truck engines. Marcus moved like a man forged in fire, a weapon given breath and bones. Each strike was purposeful, unflinching, and meant to stop whatever came next. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was simply operating, processing angles, trajectories, and weaknesses with the same detachment he had used in villages halfway across the world. Only now the war had followed him home and dressed itself in denim, Confederate tattoos, and cheap beer stink. One of the attackers, a heavy-set man with a shaved head and hands like stone blocks, came in swinging with the kind of clumsy confidence born of size. His punch was wide, reckless, thrown with the weight of someone who'd never had to fight someone trained to end fights. Marcus stepped inside it, redirected the momentum, and drove a crushing elbow into the man's jaw that sent him collapsing against the hood of his own truck with a guttural groan. But for every body Marcus dropped, another seemed to emerge from the shadows, fueled by blood and ego, maybe even emboldened by watching their friends fall. The air was thick with shouts, taunts, breathless grunts of pain, and that familiar current of racial venom. Words spat like bile with every swing. "I told you," one of them screamed as he charged. "Told you to go back where you came from." Marcus met him mid-lunge, grabbed his wrist, twisted hard enough to dislocate the shoulder, and flung him bodily into another man. They both hit the pavement in a heap. "Still think this was smart?" Marcus growled between breaths, glaring at the next one stepping forward. And then he saw it, just out of the corner of his eye. One of them breaking away from the pack, dragging Imani backward by the collar of her coat, her heels scrambling against the sidewalk as she tried to twist free. She spun, elbowed him in the temple, then drove her knee upward with so much force that the man let out a sharp cry and dropped to one knee. She followed up with the broken stick she'd been wielding, swinging it downward in a wide arc that cracked across his face, sending him tumbling. Another came at her from behind, this one younger, maybe Benny again, uncertain, hesitating. Imani turned, her voice sharp, not afraid, but defiant. "Don't," she barked. "You don't want this on your conscience." But he flinched and kept coming. Marcus moved toward her, dispatching one more man with a spinning back fist that collided with bone. He reached out for Imani, but the crowd between them thickened again. Someone grabbed his arm. He broke the hold. Another swung low, hitting his ribs. Marcus absorbed the hit and brought his knee up into the man's sternum, hearing the breath burst from his lungs. The street was chaos. Lights, movement, rage, the blur of fists and flash of metal. Then, through the blur, Marcus saw him, the man who had been watching. Silent, measured, the one who hadn't rushed in with the rest. He stood just beyond the mess, near the edge of the trucks, one hand inside his jacket, eyes locked not on Marcus, but on Imani. "No," Marcus started, voice strangled with recognition. Imani turned too, sensing something behind her. The man stepped forward with eerie calm, pulling the gun from under his coat with the fluidity of someone who had done it before. His arm extended, not high, not wild, but low and level. And in that space between heartbeats, Marcus felt everything collapse inward. The sound left the world. The wind held its breath. Even the yelling stopped. "No!" Marcus screamed again, tearing through the crowd toward her. But there were too many bodies in the way, too many seconds between them and the space she stood in. The gun fired. A single flash bloomed in the dim light. The crack echoed off the buildings, loud but somehow distant, like it had come from underwater. Imani's body jerked back as if tugged by a string, the stick falling from her hand as her feet stumbled. She looked at Marcus, not in shock, not even in pain at first, but with confusion, like her brain had felt the sound before it understood what it meant. Then came the blood, dark and sudden, blooming across her shirt as she fell to her knees. Marcus reached her just before she hit the pavement, catching her with arms already stained from the fight, her weight folding into him, her head falling against his chest. He cradled her like something precious, like something he had failed to protect. One arm wrapped under her shoulders, the other pressed desperately against the wound in her side, as if he could hold time in place, reverse it somehow, press life back into her body with the strength of his will alone. Her breathing was shallow, jagged, as her fingers gripped his shirt weakly. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "Don't let them." But the rest didn't come. Her lips moved again, silent. Tires screeched in the distance as the trucks peeled out, the gang scattering like rats in the light, leaving behind a chaos of bruises, blood, and the sharp, raw sound of a man kneeling in the street, holding his sister and screaming her name into the night. The sirens came later, much later than they should have, washing over the neighborhood in waves of sound that felt more like a closing door than the arrival of help. Red and blue lights splashed across the trees, houses, and the shattered fragments of the fight, but their glare reached no further than the surface. Officers emerged in measured steps, hands already resting on weapons, postures already shaped by suspicion. They didn't approach with concern. They advanced with caution. They didn't see Marcus as the survivor. They saw a large, bloodied black man crouched over a lifeless body on a dark street, and made the same assumption this town had been making since it laid its first bricks. "Hands where we can see them!" "Now!" one of the officers barked, voice sharp enough to make a child flinch. Though Marcus didn't respond, didn't move, didn't register the words as anything other than static. His eyes were locked on Imani's face, unmoving, still waiting for breath that wasn't coming. "Step away from the body!" another officer shouted, weapon drawn now, the barrel catching the glare of a street lamp as it wavered toward his head. It wasn't until one of them yanked him to his feet, twisting his arm behind him and snapping a cuff over his wrist, that Marcus seemed to return to the present, blinking slowly as though waking from a nightmare he hadn't known was real. They shoved him toward the cruiser without explanation, read no rights, asked no questions. The cuffs bit into his wrists, a cold familiarity he hadn't felt since a mission overseas gone sideways. But here, in this town, in this neighborhood, the message was different. This wasn't caution. This wasn't due process. This was the cost of being black and alive when the violence stopped. Inside the station, they sat him alone in an interrogation room so drab it felt deliberately designed to suppress the soul. The table was bolted to the floor. The walls were gray, blank, indifferent. The camera in the corner blinked a single red light, recording a silence so loud it became oppressive. After nearly an hour, the door creaked open, and in stepped Sheriff Reuben Clagg, his belly leading him into the room like a bulldozer clearing brush, his badge crooked and his face drawn into a practiced grimace of forced sympathy. He sat across from Marcus with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who had done this many times before and believed in the theater of law, not the substance. He placed a cup of coffee on the table, untouched, cooling, not intended for comfort, and leaned back in his chair with a sigh that carried just enough dramatic weight to feel like routine. "Mr. Kane," he began, folding his hands over his stomach like a preacher about to lie, "you've had yourself quite a night." Marcus didn't reply. Clagg continued, his voice a blend of condescension and studied regret. "Now, from what we've been able to gather, there was some sort of altercation, multiple assailants, several injuries, and, tragically, your sister caught in the middle. Now, I ain't here to blame you, son, but the situation, well, it's murky." Marcus looked up then, not with anger, but with something colder, more dangerous. Awareness. "You're calling it murky?" "Well, there were no clean witnesses," Clagg replied, shrugging as though he were reciting scripture. "A couple of calls to 911 mentioned fighting. loud voices. No one mentioned a clear aggressor. You and your sister were involved in what we're considering mutual combat. Mutual combat, Marcus repeated, each syllable pronounced with surgical precision. Not shouted, not exaggerated, but sharper for the control he held around them. Clegg raised a hand like a man hoping to temper a rising wind. I know it sounds harsh, but with what little we've got, well, there's no gun recovered, and none of the men have been picked up yet. Some of them probably went straight home, claimed they were watching TV the whole time. Can't arrest people on feelings, Mr. Kane. You can arrest me. The sheriff smirked without humor. You were still on scene, covered in blood, injuries on you and on others. You fit the frame better than anyone else we found. And your name? Well, your name's going to be a liability if this turns political. Marcus leaned forward, his voice still low, still even, but tight enough to split steel. If it turns political. A black woman is dead in the middle of a street, shot by white men who surrounded us like a pack of animals. And you're worried about optics. I'm worried about evidence, Clegg replied, tapping the table. And without it, there's not much I can do. You don't want to do anything, Marcus said. The sheriff stood, slow and rehearsed, brushing imaginary lint from his lapel. You're free to go, for now. But if I were you, I'd let this go before it turns into something worse. Marcus didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stood, his movements smooth, every inch of him coiled and precise, and without another word, walked past the sheriff and out of the room, not because he believed it was over, but because he knew it wasn't. The funeral came 3 days later, held under low, overcast skies that threatened rain but never delivered it, the kind of day that pressed its weight down on the shoulders of every person in attendance. The church was filled beyond capacity, and still they came. Imani's students in neat rows with tear-streaked faces, and hand-drawn cards clutched in their small hands. Her colleagues standing like statues at the back, their grief quiet but palpable. Community members filling every pew, every hallway, every empty space with reverence and heartbreak. There were speeches, memories, voices cracking under the strain of what had been lost. Her principal read a letter she had written to herself on her first day as a teacher, full of purpose, belief, and unshakable hope. One child stood on tiptoe at the podium to say she wanted to be like Miss Kane, because Miss Kane had told her that her voice mattered, even when others tried to silence it. Marcus sat unmoving in the front row, dressed in black from collar to cuff, his face unreadable, but not indifferent. He didn't cry. His eyes were not dry out of strength, but because there was nothing left in him to release. Imani's casket was too small for someone so large in spirit. The white lilies surrounding it were too clean for the violence that had taken her. That night, in her room, surrounded by lesson plans, quotes written in cursive on scraps of paper, and sticky notes with reminders for a future she no longer had, Marcus stood at her desk, reading her handwriting like scripture. There was a note tucked into her mirror frame, a quote from Baldwin written in her steady, looping hand. The place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it. He stared at the note. He folded it into his pocket, and by morning, he was no longer in mourning. He was in motion. The man who returned to the outskirts of Lockridge days after the funeral was not the one who had stepped off that bus with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a tired smile hiding behind his eyes. That man had come home. The man who now moved through its edges, unseen but always watching, had stepped into war. Not the kind waged with clear rules and government insignias, but the kind fought in the silences between official statements, in alleys that never saw sunlight, in the places where the law didn't reach because it chose not to. Marcus had always been methodical. The army had taught him that instinct was only valuable when sharpened against intelligence, that every operation needed recon before action. So he didn't rush. He listened. He observed. And in the dim circles of cheap bars, strip mall liquor stores, and backlots where rusted trucks huddled like conspirators, he began to hear Benny Slade's name whispered. Never loud, never certain, but always with the tension of guilt trailing just behind it. Benny wasn't hard to find. He wasn't the type who knew how to hide. He wasn't even the type who understood why he should. The kid was 24, twitchy, pale-skinned, and always moving as though something in his bones refused to be still. He crashed most nights on a stained couch in a double-wide trailer that smelled like sweat, gun oil, and fear. The man he had been trying to become, the kind that stood in parking lots yelling slurs behind a group of like-minded cowards, was just a shell. Underneath, Benny was soft, scared, and not built for what was coming. Marcus didn't kick the door in. He waited, crouched behind the shadows of scrub pines just beyond the property line, until Benny stumbled out the back door to smoke, scratching at his ribs and mumbling to himself. When Marcus moved, he moved like breath, silent, sudden, inescapable. Benny turned just in time to see the world narrow to two dark hands gripping his collar and slamming him backward against the wall with a thud that shook the window frame. "You remember me?" Marcus asked, voice low and steady, not a whisper, but something colder, a statement of fact wrapped in calm fury. Benny's eyes widened, but his mouth only worked in small gasps. I wasn't the one, man. I swear, I didn't shoot nobody." "You were there," Marcus replied, tightening his grip just enough to shift Benny's weight onto his toes. "You watched her die and ran. I didn't know. None of us thought it was gonna go that far. We was just supposed to scare y'all, just rattle you a little. It wasn't supposed to be like that." "Who's we?" Marcus asked, pressing his forearm across Benny's throat with just enough pressure to choke the panic loose. "Say their names." Benny gagged, squirming, his hands patting at Marcus's forearm like a drowning man clawing for surface. "I can't. They'll kill me." "If you think they're more dangerous than I am, then you haven't been paying attention." Marcus dragged him back through the rear door, kicking it shut behind them, then through the trailer and out again into the yard, where his truck waited a block away, hidden behind a thicket of cedar. Benny thrashed weakly in his grip, shouting, but no neighbors stirred. Not this far out, not this late. Not when the voice belonged to someone the town already knew better than to listen to. The farmhouse sat on a patch of land west of the highway, long abandoned, half swallowed by vines and rot. Its roof sagged like tired shoulders. Its front door hung crooked on one hinge. But the basement was dry, and the back room, windowless, walled with brick, once used for canning jars and winter tools, had become what Marcus needed it to be. A place where silence could last as long as necessary. He tied Benny to a chair with cable ties, reinforced with nylon straps. There was no blood, no screams. Marcus didn't need them. His presence did the work. The cold in his eyes, the efficiency of his movements, the total absence of hesitation. It was enough. He stood in front of Benny, arms crossed, his voice a low rumble in the dead room. "Talk." "I can't," Benny said again, but his eyes betrayed him. "They'll come after me. Hawk. He don't play. He's ex-military, but he's crazy, man. Calls himself a patriot, but he's got a basement full of guns and manifestos." "Start with Hawk," Marcus interrupted. "Name, full name, where he stays, who he trusts. Then work your way down." Benny hesitated, shaking now, sweat dripping from his brow, as if his own body was trying to escape him. "I want all of them," Marcus said. "The ones from the gas station. The ones from that night. Every single one who stood there and did nothing. The list came slowly at first, broken, muttered through chattering teeth and stammered panic. Names, nicknames, descriptions. One man with a birthmark on his neck. Another who always wore military boots but never served. Hawk, Derek Voss, was at the top, always at the center. Ran a prepper camp in the woods north of town. Funded by donations and hate. Supposedly untouchable. Connected. Feared. Marcus didn't take notes. He remembered everything. When it was done, he stood there for a long moment, staring at Benny like one might study a caged animal, not out of pity, but as if considering whether releasing it served any real purpose. He walked out of the room without another word, the door creaking shut behind him, and left Benny tied in place, his fate unresolved, his sobbing echoing behind the walls as the night reclaimed its silence. By the time Marcus returned to Zeke's compound, the moon had vanished behind heavy clouds, and the trees whispered in the dark with the confidence of old secrets. Zeke didn't need to ask questions when Marcus stepped into the shed. They spoke the same language now. Without ceremony, Zeke unlocked the armory and opened it wide, revealing a curated collection of weapons, gear, and IDs like relics in a war museum curated by ghosts. Marcus moved through it without hesitation, collecting what he needed. A suppressed .45, 2 burners, forged plates for a black Tacoma, a soft ballistic vest, and a combat knife he recognized from an op they had done in the Balkans. Zeke handed him a sat phone and 3 hollow point magazines without saying a word. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was ritual. Marcus finally broke it. He talked. Said Hawk's growing something. Zeke nodded slowly. You gonna knock on his door? I'm gonna burn everything around it first. The first hit came 24 hours later. An old barn sitting behind a closed-down radiator shop, barely visible from the highway, hidden behind rusted plows and stacks of rotting tires. Marcus had eyes on it for a full hour before making his move, watching the pattern of headlights from the road, listening for dogs, feeling the quiet change when the wind shifted. The lock was new, but the hinges were old. It only took a thin pry bar and silence. Inside, stacked under tarps and wooden crates, were 24 rifles, ammo boxes stamped with government cereals, and a dusty fridge filled with Gatorade and beer. One cooler in the corner held bags of beef jerky, instant coffee, and pamphlets titled The Second Bloodline, rhetoric soaked in paranoia and myth, filled with warnings of race wars and reclaiming ancestral pride. He didn't hesitate. He took pictures of everything, labels, serial numbers, fingerprinted crates, then laid strips of thermite beneath the ammo boxes and set the timers. When the heat came, it came fast and without drama, the barn glowing from within before collapsing in on itself with a sigh. By the time the fire department arrived, Marcus was already 2 counties away, clean and invisible. The second hit brought answers. It came in the form of a man named Caleb Roan, a 35-year-old with a limp and a Confederate flag inked into his neck. Caleb lived in a modified trailer hidden behind a timber lot that stank of oil, pine resin, and sweat. Marcus reached him just after midnight. There were no guards, no dogs, just a man who had stopped locking his doors because he didn't believe the world could touch him. He was wrong. The silence inside the trailer had that brittle kind of quality, like ice stretched too thin over a deep, black lake, so that when it broke, it shattered all at once. Marcus didn't knock. He didn't announce. He came through the back door low and quick, his boots silent against the soft linoleum, his silhouette a shadow before the first man even had time to register that death had arrived in the shape of a man. The first sound was the muffled scrape of a chair leg being pushed back too fast. Marcus moved in a blur, a tight pivot into the kitchen doorway, where Caleb Roan sat half-dressed at a cluttered table, a sandwich halfway to his mouth frozen open in a stupid, delayed reaction. Before the chair could fall backward, Marcus was on him. He crossed the room with mechanical speed, his left hand batting the plate away, ceramic shattering against the floor, as his right slammed into Caleb's throat, collapsing his windpipe enough to drop him back into the seat without a scream. Caleb gasped, eyes wide, hands fluttering toward his neck like birds crashing against a windowpane. Marcus didn't give him space to recover. He brought his knee up, hard, slamming it into Caleb's chest, driving the breath from him with a sickening crunch as ribs gave way. Caleb wheezed, coughing blood onto his shirt, but Marcus was already behind him, one arm around the man's throat, the other wrapping a thick black cable tie around his wrists, before Caleb even understood how badly outmatched he was. The chair tipped, but Marcus caught it mid-fall, slammed it back down with a force that cracked the rear leg. Caleb thrashed weakly, red leaking from the corner of his mouth, eyes swimming with panic as Marcus stepped back just enough to look at him, just enough to be seen clearly in the pale yellow light of the overhead bulb. "No screaming," Marcus said, voice low and calm, like someone delivering instructions over a headset. "You scream, I break your jaw. You lie, I make you remember why fear has a face." I don't know what you—" Caleb started, his voice hoarse, panicked. Marcus moved so fast it was almost unseen. He brought his elbow down across the man's face, a short, brutal arc that split the skin along Caleb's cheekbone and knocked his head sideways like a rag doll's. Blood sprayed across the table. Caleb choked on it, coughing, spitting, trying to shake his head but failing. One of his eyes was already swelling shut. "You were there," Marcus said. Not a question. A statement. "Gas station." Then the alley. I didn't shoot anybody. I didn't even have a gun. I was just back up. I swear." "You watched her bleed. You walked away." "I didn't know. I didn't think she—" Marcus drove his fist into the man's midsection, low and angled, crushing into the side of his ribs with enough force to make Caleb gag. The chair bucked beneath him. His whole body spasmed, and he nearly tipped. But Marcus grabbed the back of his hair and yanked his head upright again. "She died in my arms," Marcus said, his voice not loud but weighted, soaked with grief that had turned poisonous. "And now you're going to give me every name you've ever heard, shouted across a field, whispered in the back of a truck, spoken like gospel by men who think the world owes them something for being born in the right skin." Caleb sobbed, a mess of pain and terror. Hawk runs it all, man. I only got pulled in last year. He's ex-military, or claims to be. He's got training drills, a goddamn training camp in the woods, north of the reservoir. Says the system's broken, that we're gonna bring back order. Real order. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "How many?" "I don't know. Maybe 50 or 60 regulars. More on rotation. They don't talk to each other much. Everyone's siloed. Hawk set it up like a unit. Small teams, isolated. And you're his errand boy." Caleb coughed hard, blood splattering onto his lap. I carry gear, deliver crates. I don't shoot. I swear it. I never meant for her to die." Marcus studied him, unmoving. "But she did." Caleb nodded, tears streaking through the blood and sweat. "Yeah, she did." Marcus pulled a phone from his pocket, flipped through a few images he'd taken from the burned barn. The weapons, the pamphlets, the maps. He held it up to Caleb's face. "What's this? I want locations. Who handles supply? Who prints these lies? I can draw it. I got a map, hidden under the sink." Marcus stepped back slowly, his breathing calm, his gloves wet but steady. "You're going to draw it. Then you're going to sit here and pray." And if I come back and find even one lie, you're not going to die fast. You're going to wish you were Benny." Caleb blinked. "Is he—" But Marcus had already turned, walking into the kitchen, pulling open drawers, snapping open the false bottom beneath the sink, and retrieving the rolled-up topographic map that Caleb had stashed like it would save his life one day. It wouldn't. Not now. By the time he left, the man was still tied up, his face a ruin of bruises, lips swollen, eyes wild with fear. Marcus didn't look back. He didn't have to. Caleb had seen what he needed to see. What mattered now were the names, and the path they formed. Hawk wasn't just assembling angry men. He was building a war machine. Marcus now had proof of it. And he would dismantle it one artery at a time, until there was nothing left for Hawk to command but ashes and regret. Outside, the wind had picked up. Trees leaned into the dark like silent witnesses. Marcus climbed into the truck, laid the map across the seat, and started the engine. The dash light glowed across his face as he drove into the woods, the road winding tighter with every mile. Somewhere ahead, another safe house waited. More weapons, more names, more men who thought they were ready. They weren't. The sheriff showed up just after dawn, as the fog was still lifting off the road in long, lazy curls, and the last of the night's quiet hadn't yet been chased off by the sound of engines or birdsong. Marcus had parked the truck outside a run-down diner on the edge of town, his coffee cooling untouched in front of him as he sat alone in a back booth beneath a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a broken memory. He had come not for food, but for calm, though he wasn't sure he still understood what that meant anymore. Clegg slid into the booth without asking, the creak of old vinyl groaning beneath his weight. He didn't take off his hat, just tilted it back enough to show the lines carved deep into his face, the years of looking the other way etched into every crease like a road map of cowardice. "You've been busy," the sheriff said, voice flat, not unkind, but distant in the way a man might speak to someone he knew was already walking toward something final. 3 fires in 5 days. Storage units, barns, safe houses. Funny how it's always the ones we don't talk about that seem to burn first. Marcus didn't look at him. He just stared out the window at the haze rolling across the asphalt, his reflection sharp in the glass. Clegg sighed and shifted in his seat, folding his thick hands on the table. "I figured we might chat before this thing gets out of hand. Some of these boys you're chasing, they're dangerous, but they're not the only ones. You get what I'm saying?" "I do," Marcus said quietly, still not looking at him. "There's lines in this town, son. Been drawn long before you came back. You go crossing too many, things start to break loose. Good people get hurt." Marcus finally turned his head, slowly, the weight of his gaze falling on the sheriff like a curtain. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "She was a teacher, Reuben. A woman who spent her life trying to make this town better, one kid at a time. She bled out in my arms on a cracked street, less than 3 blocks from her home. And you? You called it mutual combat." Clegg's eyes flickered for just a second. He shifted again, his boots scraping the floor. "There wasn't evidence," he murmured. "You know how it is. No witnesses willing to speak. No one wants to stir things up." "There were bodies," Marcus said, still calm. "There was blood. There was a gang of white men with weapons who walked away. And you didn't stir anything. You buried it." Clegg leaned forward now, dropping the mask. "You're pushing this town to the edge, Kane. They're talking. Not just the ones you're after. Good people, too. Folks who want this all to go away. I'm not interested in good people who tolerate murder. You got no badge, no right. You're running on fumes and anger? I'm trying to keep the lid on this before it turns into something we can't come back from." Marcus stood without raising his voice or his hands. He simply rose from the booth, with the kind of quiet that filled every inch of air between them. "You're too late, Reuben," he said. "We already passed that point the moment you let them walk away." Clegg narrowed his eyes. "You think this makes you right?" Marcus leaned down just enough that his words would reach no one but the man across from him. "No," he said, "but it makes me the consequence." He turned to leave, then paused, just as the sheriff reached for his coffee. "One more thing," Marcus said, glancing over his shoulder. "You're on the list now." And then he was gone, boots clicking against linoleum, the door swinging shut behind him as the sheriff stared down at a cup he no longer had the stomach to drink from. Tighter. That night, Marcus sat in the farmhouse again, alone except for the photo of Imani propped against a rafter above the desk, a smiling print from her graduation day, her cap slightly askew, eyes bright with a kind of belief he no longer remembered how to carry. He stared at the photo for a long time, the silence wrapping around him like gauze pulled tight. "Would you forgive me for this?" he asked the still air, voice rough with exhaustion and something older, deeper. "Would you even recognize me now?" He reached out and brushed dust from the frame. "I tried to wait. I waited for the system. I waited for the law. But they waited longer. Long enough to bury you. Long enough to move on." He didn't cry. He hadn't in days. Grief had folded inward, twisted into a shape sharp enough to cut through everything he touched. Zeke showed up the next morning, stepping into the barn with a scowl, a duffel slung over his shoulder and mud on his boots. He tossed the bag onto the floor and crossed his arms. "You're unraveling," he said flatly. Marcus didn't look up. He was reloading magazines, each movement smooth and practiced. "You're not making war," Zeke continued. "You're chasing ghosts through fire. You think she'd want this?" Marcus glanced up now, eyes flat, expression unreadable. "I don't know what she'd want anymore." "I do," Zeke said. "She wanted people to live better, to get better. You think this blood is making anything right?" Marcus finished loading the last mag, clicked it into the rifle, and stood. "It's making sure it doesn't happen again." Zeke's jaw clenched. "Just make sure it doesn't take you with it." The man Marcus had been hunting went by the name Dean Dog Mercer, a nickname earned in high school when he beat a smaller classmate senseless for wearing a Malcolm X shirt on campus. He was the kind of man who made cowardice look like confidence, always operating in groups, always half a step behind the biggest voice in the room, but never hesitating when it came time to put hands on someone who couldn't hit back. He'd been quiet since the attack, lying low in a trailer outside Winder Ridge, cutting firewood and staying off phones. But Marcus knew that kind of man didn't disappear. He just waited for a new order. It took 2 days of tracking, 2 nights without sleep, and a bribe to a part-time mechanic who'd once run guns for Zeke to pinpoint his exact location. Mercer had holed up in a double-wide rusting from the base up, parked crooked beside a dry creek bed lined with broken glass and black water. Marcus approached just after sundown. The crickets had quieted, and the last light of day threw long shadows across the woods, like fingers stretching from the grave. He didn't knock. The door went in under the weight of his boot, splinters flying like shrapnel as Marcus moved inside, low and fast, gun drawn but angled downward, his body close to the wall. The trailer stank of old meat, mold, and sweat, but Marcus barely noticed. His ears tuned instantly to the sound of movement. Floorboards creaking to the right, something metal falling, then the sound of a body rushing forward. Mercer burst from the hallway, swinging a rusted crowbar like a man who believed desperation could match training. Marcus slipped the first swing, ducking left and driving a palm up into Mercer's forearm so hard that the impact snapped the bone with a wet pop. Mercer screamed, staggered, but didn't drop the weapon. He simply switched hands and lunged again. This time, Marcus let him come. He stepped inside the arc of the swing, catching Mercer's elbow and twisting it backward at an impossible angle. The crowbar fell. Mercer roared and threw a wild punch with his free hand. But Marcus ducked it, brought his knee up into the man's stomach, then again, higher, into his ribs. He felt something crack. Mercer folded forward, gasping like a fish thrown on concrete. But Marcus wasn't done. He grabbed Mercer by the shirt collar, slammed him face first into the counter, then again into the wall, the impact deep enough to leave a smear of blood and broken drywall. Mercer sagged, dazed, but when Marcus reached for the cuffs, the man lashed out again, head-butting backward, catching Marcus just below the eye. The flash of pain was sharp and immediate. Blood blurred his vision, and something inside Marcus snapped. He slammed Mercer onto the kitchen table, drove his elbow into the back of the man's neck once, twice, until the wood cracked beneath them, and Mercer collapsed to the floor in a heap of twitching limbs and hoarse, incoherent gasps. Marcus straddled him, one hand on the man's collar, the other forming into a fist that hovered, ready, aching to end it. "You remember her?" Marcus growled, his voice so low it scraped the edge of sanity. "The black woman you grabbed, the one trying to stop you from killing an innocent couple. My sister. Her name was Imani." Mercer blinked up at him, one eye already swelling shut, blood pouring from a split in his lip. I didn't shoot. Wasn't me." "But you held her down," Marcus snarled. "You pinned her while they closed in. You helped." "I didn't know," he gasped. "I didn't know she'd—" Marcus drove his fist into the man's gut, twisting the heel of his palm in like he was grinding the breath from his lungs. Mercer wheezed, spat blood, curled halfway before Marcus slammed him back down. There was nothing between them now but violence and breath, and the shattered pieces of something neither of them had words for. He drew the pistol, pressed the muzzle against Mercer's temple, felt the man go still beneath him. Everything inside Marcus screamed to finish it, to empty himself of this rage once and for all, to silence the thing that had broken his life in one night and walked away untouched. But then he saw her, not in some ghostly way, not in that distant, dreamy vision that haunted quiet corners of memory. He saw her face, smiling in that photo above the farmhouse desk, cap tilted sideways, defiant even in stillness. He heard her voice, not screaming, not begging, but calling his name that night, trying to say something with her last breath, something that wasn't a curse, something that asked him to remember. Marcus lowered the gun. He stood, breathing hard, staring down at the broken man beneath him. Mercer whimpered once. "Please, don't kill me." Marcus didn't answer. He wrapped the man in duct tape, tight and unflinching. Ankles, wrists, across the mouth. Then he hoisted him over his shoulder like dead weight and carried him outside, down the dirt road, through the sleeping town until he reached the edge of the park, where the community gathered for church picnics and Juneteenth concerts, where Imani once ran workshops for kids who didn't know what safety felt like. There, beneath the pale wash of a flickering street lamp, Marcus tied Mercer to a light post. Arms bound, eyes swollen shut, blood crusting in layers across his jaw. Then he taped a sign to the man's chest in black block letters. "Murderer." He stepped back, silent. Let the town see it in the morning. Let the ones still hiding understand that silence no longer kept them safe. And then he vanished into the dark. The moment Hawk saw the photograph of Dean Mercer strapped to a signpost in the middle of town with the word "murderer" duct-taped to his chest, he knew the reckoning had arrived. It wasn't the blood that rattled him, or the bruises, or the way Mercer's face had swelled into something unrecognizable, his one visible eye turned glassy with shame. It was the precision, the message. It was the fact that whoever had done this hadn't needed to kill to make the world shake. And worse, he'd done it without fear. For a man like Hawk, whose strength came from the illusion of control, that kind of precision wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war. He moved quickly after that. The next 24 hours saw encrypted chatter buzzing across militia channels, lieutenants summoned from drills, caches moved, and plans accelerated. Hawk's movements became sharper, his tone clipped. He called his inner circle to the quarry, and this time it wasn't to posture or grandstand, it was to act. The photo of Zeke came out first. Grainy surveillance pulled from one of the side roads near his shop. The old man, unarmed, locking the compound gates for the night. "This man," Hawk announced, holding up the image with a gloved hand, "has been supplying our enemy, hiding him, arming him, protecting a killer who targets his own kind." The men around him, armed, masked, faces lit by the dull orange glow of oil barrels burning near the center, murmured with agitation. Someone spit. Another one muttered, "Traitor!" Hawk raised his voice, slicing through the unrest like a cleaver. "This is not just about one man. This is about what we've built. About what we will build. He thinks he can shame us, take us out one by one, parade us like animals while the rest of the world claps." He stepped closer to the fire. His shadow danced against the rocks, long and jagged. "But we are not animals. We are the bloodline that remembers what America was meant to be. We are the defenders of its bones, its soul." There were shouts now, cries of agreement, rifle stocks lifted into the air, boots stomped in the dirt like the beat of something ancient and ugly. "He wants a war?" Hawk growled, baring his teeth. "We bring it to his door. Starting with that old bastard." They hit Zeke's place at 3:17 a.m., just as the town was deep in sleep, and the fog was thick enough to mute sound. 3 trucks, 6 men. Only 2 came out unscathed. They underestimated him. Zeke had seen more wars than they had birthdays. The shop was rigged with a dead man's switch, trip alarms, shatter points in the floor, and a wall panel that slid open to reveal more firepower than any man had business keeping. But he hadn't built it for fear. He'd built it for moments like this. A Molotov caught fire near the workshop. A man got hit in the leg with buckshot before he could breach the side entrance. Another slipped on oil Zeke had poured beneath the workbench and landed on a nail board that drove straight through his foot. Still, Zeke didn't come out clean. He took a round through the shoulder and another across the thigh before they peeled away, one screaming into the trees, the others dragging bodies into the back of their trucks as they fled into darkness. When Marcus arrived an hour later, the smell of charred wood still hung in the air like smoke from a dying sermon. The door was half blown open, one hinge twisted, the ground littered with glass, spent shells, and blood trails disappearing into the woods. Zeke sat on a crate by the ruined entryway, shirt soaked with blood, his right arm in a sling and gauze pressed into his shoulder. He looked up when Marcus approached, and somehow still managed a crooked smile. "I was wondering when you'd show." Marcus crouched, scanning the wounds, the scorch marks on the floor, the broken shelves. "You're lucky to be alive." Zeke gave a dry, rasping chuckle. "Luck had nothing to do with it. They were dumb and loud. Probably thought I'd be asleep." Marcus looked at him now, really looked. The pain was there, obvious in the way he winced every time the wind shifted. But so was something deeper. Weariness and worry. "This can't go on," Zeke said quietly. "This ain't a righteous path anymore. It's a war now, Marcus. A real one. Not just between you and Hawk, but between 2 Americas trying to tear each other apart." Marcus didn't answer. Zeke's steady hand closed around Marcus's forearm, firm despite the tremor. I know you want to stop him, and I don't blame you. Just don't set the whole world on fire to watch one man fall." That night, Marcus returned to the ridge overlooking the quarry. His black gear blended into the trees, his boots dug deep into the earth. A small secured recorder blinked red on his chest. Below, the militia gathered. Hawk stood tall, pacing before the fire, his arms raised like a preacher about to call down thunder. The crowd was larger now. Dozens of men and women, faces hidden by masks or paint, rifles across their backs, handguns on their hips. They didn't come for strategy. They came for fury. And Hawk gave it to them. "They're coming for us," he boomed, voice echoing off stone and trees. "The media, the feds, the traitors in our own backyard. They want to shame us for remembering who we are." He raised a fist. "They want us to kneel, to beg, to apologize for surviving. But not today." Cheers rose, loud, chaotic, carried by violence and fantasy. "We don't apologize. We defend, we cleanse, we reclaim." Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. Just let the recorder run. Every word was another nail. Chut! Later, back at the farmhouse, Zeke sat propped against a wall, stitched and pale, but awake. Marcus played back the recording. Static buzzed between Hawk's words, but the hate came through clear. So did the intent. Zeke listened without speaking. When it ended, he let out a slow breath. "You get him talking like that in front of the wrong people," he said. "He'll hang himself." Marcus looked out into the dark. "No," he said. "He doesn't get the rope. I'm bringing the hammer." The video went live at dawn. No fanfare, no taglines, no branding. Just a single anonymous account on multiple platforms. The title marked simply, "This is what they're preparing for." The footage started with Hawk's speech at the quarry, his voice raw with fury, cutting through the grainy audio like a blade sharpened on history's ugliest echoes. The firelight flickered behind him, casting warped shadows across his followers, rifles slung over shoulders, fists raised high. The words played unedited, uninterrupted. "Defenders of America. Purity by sacrifice. Cleanse the sickness." Every line bled with venom, and every face illuminated in the crowd was sharp enough for a pause and zoom. Then came the second reel. Clips of interrogations. Voices distorted. Faces blurred. But the confessions were unmistakable. Men admitting to the ambush. Admitting they knew it would happen. One describing the moment Imani Kane was pulled back and pinned while others shouted, while someone pulled the trigger. The words were raw, uncoached, ripped from men who had not expected to survive the conversation they were having. The internet did the rest. Within hours, the post had spread beyond the borders of Georgia. Activist groups reposted it across social channels. Hashtags surged. Newsrooms scrambled to verify. By midday, digital overlays of the grainy faces began circulating. Crowdsourced, annotated, and distributed. Marcus didn't have to name names. The world had begun doing that for him. Protesters marched in front of the county courthouse before the afternoon sun could melt the dew off the lawn. Cardboard signs painted overnight read, "Justice for Imani, who protects us from them?" And we saw the video. People poured in from neighboring towns and across state lines, crowding courthouse steps, demanding arrests, calling for accountability. Reporters arrived with cameras and mics. Drones hummed overhead. The story was no longer local. It had breached the walls. And that made Sheriff Clagg nervous. He held a press conference in front of the county building, his words rehearsed, jacket crisp, badge gleaming in the sun like a deflection. Behind him stood two deputies, stone-faced. He spoke of order, of patience, of letting investigations proceed through the proper channels. And then, when pressed on the footage, He offered the line that would echo for days. "This town doesn't answer to outsiders, nor will we let agitators exploit tragedy for politics." The cameras caught it all: the condescension, the tightening jaw, the subtle tilt of the head when he spoke the word agitators. The protests doubled in size by nightfall. But Marcus wasn't watching speeches. He was already moving. The weapons shipment was scheduled for midnight. A semi-truck rerouted off Highway 23, meeting two pickups at a storage depot masquerading as a feed supply company. The intel had come from a burner phone text message dropped by one of the gang members Marcus had let walk. Some of them weren't loyal anymore. Not after what they'd seen. Fear turned rats into messengers. Marcus arrived at the site early, concealed by night and silence. He'd scouted the location the day before, noting blind spots in the surveillance, routes for escape, soft points in the fencing. Zeke's satchel sat in the passenger seat of the truck. Inside it, 2 bricks of military-grade C4, rigged with remote detonation and packed tight with shrapnel salvaged from the old compound. He waited for the trucks to arrive, watched them pull in through the east gate, headlights off, tires crunching over gravel. Watched as 4 men exited, 1 from each vehicle, 2 carrying bolt cutters, another swinging open the steel loading door to the warehouse. The semi's rear doors creaked open. Inside, crates stamped with vague manufacturer labels, but Marcus knew what was in them: ARs, ammo belts, explosives, enough firepower to equip a private army. He moved while they unloaded, a ghost in the dark, slipped between shadows, placed the charges beneath the truck axles and inside the storage shed's rear corner, near the wiring where the fire would spread fastest. Each move was clean, precise. He didn't leave fingerprints, didn't even leave footprints. By the time the 3rd crate hit the ground, Marcus was already back at his vantage point, the detonator cold in his gloved hand. He waited until they were inside, until the last box had been pried open, and one of the men gave a long, low whistle of admiration. Then he pressed the switch. The explosion didn't come in a roar. It came in a sequence, a controlled fury that tore through steel and night, fire blooming in calculated bursts, first beneath the semi, which flipped onto its side like a dying beast, then through the warehouse wall as the charges inside ignited the wiring. The air turned orange. Men screamed. One staggered out, arms flailing, shirt on fire. Another crawled on all fours, coughing smoke. Marcus didn't fire a shot. He just stood in the tree line and watched the sky burn. By morning, news helicopters circled the depot like vultures. The sheriff's office cordoned off the scene with tape, but there wasn't much left to salvage. The weapons were destroyed, the building unsalvageable, the vehicles charred bones on blackened gravel. Reporters speculated about rival groups. Protesters claimed sabotage. Officials called it an internal mishap. But online? The same anonymous account that posted the Hawk video returned, this time with 4 words: "You will not arm." By the time Marcus tracked down the last man from the gas station, the town had all but turned inside out. The protests had made the headlines. Hawk's face had gone from obscured backwoods boogeyman to something sharper, something more exposed. The gang had scattered into bunkers and hideouts like roaches flushed from drywall, but Marcus hunted with the precision of a man who knew the exact weight of his mission. This final target, Randy Coyle, wasn't the loudest during the attack, nor the first to throw a punch, but he had stayed longer than most. He had stood with his back against the car, arms crossed, while the others shouted slurs and fists flew. He had watched Imani fall. Randy had fled north after the video surfaced, hoping to disappear into a cousin's trailer near the ridge. He didn't make it far. Marcus caught him 2 counties over, trying to buy burner phones and canned beans with trembling hands, at a 24-hour truck stop. He didn't fight. He barely ran. He knew who Marcus was. Everyone did now. The interrogation was clean. Ruthless, but clean. It didn't need drawn-out violence, not anymore. Marcus had long since learned that the threat of silence, of not knowing what was coming next, could crack a man faster than a broken rib. He bound Randy to a chair in the back of a boarded-up hunting lodge and waited, letting the dark press in. No questions. No accusations. Just the heavy weight of Marcus's presence. Eventually, the fear split open. "They've got a place in the woods," Randy muttered, barely audible. "Not on any maps, no roads, no markers. They call it the Route. Hawk built it after that trial a few years back. Said it was time to have something permanent, something pure." Marcus leaned forward slowly, never blinking. How many men? 20, maybe more. All armed. Some of them ex-military, dishonorably discharged. Some just angry. They've got towers made from repurposed RVs, spotters posted all hours. You can't walk up without them seeing you coming. But they think they're untouchable now, like they're the last line of defense. "And Clag?" Marcus asked, his voice low, surgical. Randy hesitated, then nodded. "He's been backing them from the start. Doesn't wear the colors, but he knows everything. Hawk calls him our man in the courthouse." Marcus said nothing more. He left Randy gagged and zip-tied to a tree behind the lodge, with a handwritten note stapled to his shirt. Confessed. Coward. He wouldn't die. That wasn't the goal. Fear was more useful than a corpse. Back at the farmhouse, the map was already laid bare across the length of Zeke's workbench, curling slightly at the corners from heat and time. Marcus stood over it with his hands pressed flat against the edges, eyes locked on the elevation lines, memorizing every inch like scripture. Zeke circled the compound's suspected location with a thick black marker, tapping the center twice before sliding over a second map, detailing the terrain. "This whole ridge here's unstable," Zeke explained, his tone clipped with focus. "You try to scale it from the east, you'll either fall or trigger the motion alerts they've got buried in the shale. Your best approach is the north runoff. It's dry now, barely a creek bed, but deep enough to get close without being spotted." Marcus traced the route with his finger, his mind already mapping movement, cover, timing. "What's the fallback?" "There's a natural drop about a mile out. If things go bad, you dive and roll. I've got a truck waiting near the line, but you won't get a second run at this." Marcus nodded once, slowly. "I don't intend to." They spent the next hour walking through every scenario: entry points, escape routes, fallback positions. Zeke pointed out natural chokeholds where smoke grenades could buy seconds. Marcus calculated angles of approach for each structure, identifying which buildings likely held ammo, fuel, or gear caches that could double as hazards or cover. It was an operation constructed not for combat, but for surgical disruption. If Marcus got caught, it would become a bloodbath. But if he timed it right, if he moved through the chaos and used the fire like a blade, then maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. That night, the woods surrounding the compound pulsed with tension. Wind moved through the pines in low whispers, pushing leaves in dry circles across dirt paths carved by off-road trucks and boot treads. Marcus moved with them, blending into the rhythm of the trees, every breath measured, every step silent. He wore patched fatigues and a militia jacket stolen from a burned-out safe house, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes hard behind the brim of a trucker's cap. No one questioned him as he passed the outer watch line. The militia had grown lazy, too confident in their numbers, too sure no one would dare come close. The inner camp opened wide like a mouth. Rows of tents, trailers, and floodlights surrounded a central fire pit where bodies swayed to Hawk's voice. The man stood on a raised platform, preaching again to his congregation of armed believers. Words like blood, heritage, and sacrifice spilled from his lips like a sermon long rehearsed. They responded with stomps, gunshots in the air, fists raised in call and response. It was less a rally than a ritual. Marcus moved through them like a shadow, head down, body slouched just enough to disappear into the crowd. His heart pounded a steady rhythm, but not with fear. This was focus, the kind he'd trained for, the kind he'd used in villages overseas, moving through enemy terrain with a calmness that defied the chaos around him. Then, across the clearing, he saw it. Clegg. The sheriff stood near the fire, smiling. Not nervous, not cautious, smiling. He wore his badge, still clipped to his belt like it meant something. He was shaking Hawk's hand with the ease of an old friend, leaning close to say something private. Hawk laughed, slapped Clegg's shoulder, and nodded toward the crowd like they were kings observing a loyal army. In that moment, everything Marcus suspected was confirmed. Not in words, not in paper trails, but in posture, in proximity, in the shameless comfort between men who knew exactly what they were doing and how long they had been doing it. The explosion tore through the compound like the roar of a god tired of waiting. 1 second, Hawk was standing near the fire pit, still basking in the sound of his followers' approval. The next, the far eastern side of the encampment ignited into a wall of fire and splintered steel. One of the old fuel storage tanks, long dormant and half-buried, went up in a bloom of red-orange flame so bright it turned the night sky into a second sun. The shockwave punched through the trees, scattering tents and rattling the trailers on their axles, and the fire consumed the perimeter wall like it had been made of paper and pride. Screams followed. Men grabbed weapons and scrambled, radios squawking half-sentences, orders layered over panic. Someone opened fire blindly into the tree line. Another shouted about sabotage, about federal agents, about betrayal. Marcus was already moving. In the chaos, his mask still in place, he slipped from the outer circle into the core of the compound, ducking low between the shadows of overturned crates and toppling floodlights. He moved with no hesitation, no waste in his steps. Every muscle remembered the layout from the maps. Every instinct was sharpened to surgical precision. His first target was Donnie Rawls, a heavy-set enforcer with broken knuckles and a temper that had snapped too many jaws in backroom beatings. Donnie came around the corner of the main bunker wielding a shotgun, shouting at no one in particular, eyes wide with confusion. He didn't even register Marcus until the elbow struck his throat like a hammer. Donnie wheezed once, stumbled back, and Marcus was already inside his space, driving his knee into the gut, then slamming the man's head against the trailer's corner so hard that the metal rattled and the breath left Donnie's lungs in one final grunt. Marcus didn't wait to see him drop. Another figure lunged at him from the smoke, Kirk Blaylock, the lean, wiry bastard who'd laughed the loudest in the interrogation tapes. He came in fast, a combat knife flashing in the firelight. Marcus sidestepped the first swing, blocked the second with a forearm that sent white heat through his bones, then countered with a rising palm strike that shattered Blaylock's nose in a burst of red. The man stumbled but didn't fall, slashing wildly as Marcus spun low, caught his wrist, and twisted until the blade clattered to the dirt. They grappled, boots digging into the earth, bodies slamming against the side of a generator that sparked and hissed. Blaylock got in a knee to the ribs that knocked the wind out of Marcus for half a second, but it wasn't enough. Marcus drove a headbutt square into his jaw, then shoved him back and ended it with a strike to the throat that left him gasping, clawing at the air like it could give him back what he'd lost. The noise around them built to a fever pitch. Flares screamed overhead, casting crimson strobe light patterns across the panicked compound. Trucks reversed blindly. One trailer had caught fire and now burned uncontrolled, sending thick smoke rolling through the rally area like the breath of something ancient and vengeful. Through the haze, Marcus saw Tanner Groves, another name, another face from that cursed night, trying to organize a counterformation near the south fence. He was shouting to two others, both with rifles, pointing toward the direction of the explosions. Marcus raised his sidearm and dropped one with a clean shot to the leg. Tanner spun, aimed, but Marcus was already moving, rolling behind a stack of crates and coming up beside the second shooter, disarming him with a brutal arm lock and throwing him to the ground with enough force to crack ribs. The rifle came up again. Marcus fired once, non-lethal. It clipped Tanner in the shoulder, spun him halfway around. He dropped the gun but kept his footing. He raised both hands. "I ain't the one who pulled the trigger," he said, voice hoarse, bleeding from the mouth. "I didn't kill her, man." Marcus stepped forward, close enough to see the fear flare up in the whites of his eyes. He didn't say a word, just punched him, once, hard enough to flatten him. Then the world shifted. A shot cracked through the smoke, close, too close. The round skimmed past Marcus's side, hot and violent, grazing the tactical vest and digging a shallow groove across his ribs. The second shot would have ended it, but it never came, because from somewhere high, somewhere sharp and waiting, Zeke's rifle sang once, a single thunderclap from the ridge. The man who'd lined up the shot on Marcus dropped before his body even realized it was dead. Neck split open, rifle tumbling beside him. The echo of Zeke's rifle cracked through the chaos like a verdict, snapping Marcus from the fog of violence and pain. Amidst the flames, screams, and collapsing bodies, he tasted smoke and iron. His side burned where the bullet had grazed him, but adrenaline carried him forward down the corridor of injured loyalties and broken commands. Every shadow seemed to spin with danger, but every step moved him closer to the bunker where Hawk waited. The militia's compound was designed for defense, not for comfort. Narrow halls with low ceilings, reinforced doors, and angled walls that twisted lines of sight until the bunker felt less like a building and more like a trap. Marcus had studied the blueprints with Zeke under the dull light of the farmhouse. He knew there were at least 3 choke points, 2 sandbagged machine gun nests, and 1 long-dead surveillance room overlooking the internal perimeter. He had the layout mapped in memory, every inch layered with intent. He found the entrance bursting open, splintered wood strewn like breadcrumbs. Inside, the bunker smelled of sweat, diesel, and something darker, a rotting sense of righteousness left to fester underground. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, pencils of light cutting through haze like searching fingers. Marcus kept low, senses flared, breathing in time with the pulse of the compound's heartbeat. Then he saw him. Hawk stood beneath a pale bulb, trousers still dusted with the red clay of the practice field, and sleeves rolled up to reveal thick veins that pulsed with conviction and hate. He wasn't alone. 2 lieutenants flanked him, rifles raised, eyes wide with fear or fanaticism. Marcus couldn't tell which. "Well, if it isn't the avenging angel," Hawk said, his voice steady and cultured, thick southern drawl undiminished by the night's violence. "I expected you'd come for a reckoning. I even hoped you would." Hawk's eyes flicked to his men. "Boys, stay back. Let him bleed first." One of the lieutenants staggered forward, a young man whose face Marcus had seen in interrogation video. Eli Briggs, the kid who had snarled at the gas station, chest puffed out like he was defending a legacy he never earned. He lifted his rifle, fingers slipping onto the trigger. Marcus dove. He tackled Eli into a sandbag wall, rifle clattering down the corridor with a hollow thud. They grappled in tight quarters, Eli's hands clawing for leverage, Marcus's fists stepping in with the speed of training that had been honed in combat zones far different from this one. Marcus struck first, elbow into ribs, forearm against throat, driving the boy backward until he collapsed, gasping and broken. He grabbed the rifle and tossed it down the hall before stepping away, focusing on the man who had lured him here. "Hawk," Marcus said, voice low and roaring with everything he had left after the night's chaos. "This ends now." Hawk's smile didn't falter. "It's only just begun, soldier. I've been building for years. Every bruise, every tear you've inflicted, it just brings me closer." He nodded to the second lieutenant, a tall woman whose eyes burned with fervor. Marla Sable Boone, whose hands had held the binoculars the night Imani died. She lunged, blade in hand. Marcus folded into the strike, caught her arm between his wrist and forearm, twisted hard till cartilage snapped, and dropped the blade with a clatter that echoed too loud in the silence behind them. Sable's scream was soft, but it carried in the bare corridors as she fell and curled into herself. "All clean up," Hawk breathed, stepping closer, the smell of his cologne unsettling enough to coat the fear in Marcus's throat. That photo of Dean Mercer blasted across the signpost. "Are you proud of that, Kane? Proud to hang my boys in the public square? To make murder out of his name and then be celebrated like you're a vigilante hero?" Marcus closed in. He felt flames dancing across his chest where the grazing bullet had burned him. He didn't answer. He just slid on his side foot and struck Hawk in the jaw. Sharp, surprising, a strike King taught in basic. Hawk stumbled, head snapping back. Marcus pressed the momentum, forearm into Adam's apple, two quick knees to ribs. Hawk halfway fell, caught by the wall, his coat tearing on the rough surface. "You hid behind parades and political favors, and martyr images," Hawk said, between spat-out breaths. "But when it comes to a real fight, face-to-face fury, you come down here masked, bloodied, praying you're the hero in someone else's story." Marcus felt heat pulse through him, rage kindling, heart thunder drumming. He lunged again, fist flying, metal clanging off Hawk's belt buckle but cracking skin on his hip. They broke apart, each gasping, each bleeding. Hawk rolled, pulling a knife of his own from his belt. The silver blade flickered in a motionless light. "You know what I want to do," he whispered, advancing. "I want to carve into you, just like they carved her." Marcus blocked the blade with a thick forearm guard, every ripple of muscle tight and connected. He clinched Hawk close, twisting, reversing, grabbing the man's wrist and wrenching the blade from his grip. Hawk spat once, blood and pride. "Go ahead," Hawk said, tone shadowed with menace. "Finish it." Marcus stood there, heavy with the fury humming through his limbs, but also aware of every breath, every heartbeat pushing something deeper. Justice, not vengeance. Not yet. He didn't lower his arm. Instead, he brought his free hand up and struck Hawk straight across the temple with open palm. The blow landed hard, accuracy born of anger riding discipline, and Hawk staggered, stability slipping. There was a moment of stillness between them, winded, eyes locked on shared ruins. Marcus could kill him here. The bunker would echo with the shot, and they would call it finality. But Imani didn't die to perpetuate hate. She died because men decided comfort over courage. Marcus dropped to one knee, unbuckling Hawk's knife belt, stripping it away, and letting the man's own blade clatter to the floor. He didn't shout. He didn't deliver a speech. He just stared at the broken face that had once stood proud above a fire pit of hate. Hawk's voice was tiny now, a croak. "Promise me one thing." Marcus didn't look. He just ran a finger along the blade's dull length. Hawk swallowed. "That you'll live with what you've done." Marcus lifted his head, met Hawk's eyes. "It ends here. But it doesn't end with me." And without another word, he bound Hawk's hands behind his back, cuffed him with zip ties Marcus had carried since the farmhouse. He stood, battered, bruised, his chest heaving, sweat and blood and sorrow dripping from him, silent in the stillness of the final collapse of everything Hawk had built. The bunker held its breath as Marcus straightened and helped Hawk to his feet, each man a mess of pride, guilt, survival. Outside, the militia was silent, broken into smaller scavenging fights, the fire's glow flickering in the distance. He led Hawk out, into the fallout they would call justice and someone else would call war's cost, because some debts weren't paid with blood, but with the burden of living on. The compound lay in ruin beneath the ash-swept sky, its scorched remains streaked with the tangled wreckage of broken tents and shattered dreams. And amid that ruin, Marcus kneeled on the smoldering earth, his chest rising and falling in time with the dying embers, facing Hawk, the man who had built his empire on hatred and betrayal, cuffed, bloodied, and humiliated before the flickering lens of a hidden camera that hummed with the quiet power of exposure. The bite of the camera's presence was sharpened by Zeke's steady nod behind the flame-lit wreckage, and as Marcus pressed the button, he spoke directly into the lens with the moisture of sweat and conviction on his voice. "Hawk, you crafted this fortress with lies, armed these men with spite, and raised them to see blood as equality. But equality does not live in fear or the barrel of a gun. And tonight the world will bear witness to your truth." The camera tilted then to capture Hawk's expression, not defiant now, not commanding, but weathered and rattled, his eyes cold and resigned as the live feed cut to the rally footage recorded earlier, Hawk's own voice spilling through the speaker in unfiltered confession. "We are the last line of defense. Purity demands sacrifice. We will cleanse America of rot, beginning with those who would shame us from within." That phrase echoed everywhere. The rally field, the flickering screens of smartphones, the hearts of people furious at the idea that hatred had a place in their communities. As the world watched, captivated, sickened, outraged, the footage rolled forward into the bunker where Marcus's covert live feed streamed side by side with Hawk's unfiltered words. Hawk's smirk vanished as Marcus stood and spoke again, voice steady. This man led a militia in preparation for a race war. He mobilized men as if they were soldiers in a dying dream. But his dream sought destruction, not defense. The feed didn't stop there. It lingered on Hawk's shackled posture, his deflated bravado, and then moved outward to show Sheriff Clagg being escorted away in handcuffs, shame burning on his face, his silent complicity now known. Silence fell across screens around the world as the gravity of the connection set in, and protests, outraged editorials, and calls for justice erupted uncontrollably like a wildfire across every community, straining to breathe free from long-held secrets. When the final charges were read, conspiracy, incitement, domestic terrorism, Hawk stood before the court in the same uniform he wore to his army gatherings, now void of rallying cries or blind followers, and the jury delivered its verdict with deliberate clarity. Guilty, with no chance of parole, his words now empty as the echo of his downfall clung to the courthouse walls. None of this was witnessed by Marcus. He disappeared before dawn broke, leaving only unanswered questions and a single folded letter on Zeke's workbench. Inside, a line written in Marcus's steady hand. "I did it her way. In the end." Zeke held that line like a beacon in dim morning light, remembering the woman who taught them both that justice didn't have to be a gunshot echo. It could be a choice made when silence finally ended. In the years that followed, the town remained marked by scars that could never fully heal but still chose to remember, building murals and benches and forging gatherings around her memory. In classrooms, her lessons were taught again and again, not as relics of loss, but as foundations for strength, unity, and reflection. And somewhere, far from cameras and commotion, Marcus walked among communities unburdened by hatred, a quiet protector reshaping his sorrow into purpose, knowing that the purity he sought was never born of vengeance, but of remembering, and the living oath that justice must always rise above fury. When the storm finally broke, it didn't end with the last echo of gunfire or even the sight of Hawk shackled in the dirt. Justice moved slower than vengeance, but it moved, and in the days that followed, the truth Marcus had ripped from blood and silence spread like wildfire through every corner of the country. The live stream, raw, irrefutable, had done more than strip Hawk of his myth. It had shattered the illusion of isolation. The world saw not just a militia in rural Georgia, but the structure that allowed it to exist, to grow, to kill without consequence. And now, that structure was burning. Federal task forces swept through the region within hours of the broadcast, armed with names, maps, and the confessions Marcus had dragged from the mouths of men who never thought their words would leave the room. Coordinated raids dismantled what remained of Hawk's network. Safe houses raided, supply lines severed, and every known affiliate brought into custody. In town after town, men who once believed themselves untouchable found their doors broken open before sunrise, their stockpiles confiscated, their ideologies dragged into the unforgiving light of national law. The gang was not merely scattered, it was dismantled. The courts moved quickly, their cases strengthened by first-hand evidence, direct footage, and a public so inflamed by outrage that no politician dared stall the process. Those who had stood laughing outside the gas station that night now stood cuffed and silent beneath courtroom ceilings, no longer bold, no longer righteous, only afraid. Justice, long deferred, now bore the face of relentless clarity. And then came Sheriff Clagg. The footage of him shaking Hawk's hand outside the compound rally, grinning, nodding, fully engaged, surfaced within minutes of the stream's end, clipped and shared across social platforms, news cycles, and protest posters. The outcry it triggered eclipsed even the raid itself. His office, once a bastion of evasive authority, became the center of scrutiny, calls flooding in from state and federal oversight committees. By the end of the week, Clagg stood on the courthouse steps, not to address the people, but to be placed under arrest himself, the badge he once polished, now a tarnished relic in an evidence bag. He didn't speak, not to the press, not to the court, not to the people he'd abandoned. He kept his eyes down as the cuffs locked behind his back, and that, too, was broadcast to the world. And yet, for all the fury and vindication that surged through the town, the man who made it happen had already vanished. Marcus Kane had walked away from the blaze long before the cleanup began, his presence as impossible to trace as it was to deny. 1 minute, he had been there, silent, bruised, burned, but unbowed. And the next, he was gone, leaving no trail behind him except the justice he had forced into motion. He didn't return to the farmhouse. He didn't call Zeke. He didn't leave a statement or a video or a final interview. What he left was felt more than seen. A silence that settled into the edges of the story like the edge of a blade. No one knew where he went. Some said he crossed the southern border and disappeared into jungle terrain. Others swore he joined a veterans' outpost in the Dakotas, working quiet, unnoticed, still watching the world like a man not done protecting it. The truth, like Marcus himself, never offered explanation. Hawk was sentenced 2 months later after a trial that never stood a chance of acquittal. With the video evidence, the digital trail, and the wreckage of the compound catalogued piece by piece, the prosecution built a case so ironclad it became a template for dismantling hate groups across the country. Hawk sat in a federal courtroom dressed in a plain jumpsuit, face half-healed from the beating Marcus had given him, expression dull and absent of the fire he once wielded so easily. He said nothing in his own defense. Not even when they read out the charges, one after another, a litany of violence and conspiracy that painted his legacy in blood and failure. The sentence was swift: life without parole. Not for glory, not for ideology, but for murder, incitement, and the machinery of hate he had operated like a business. When the gavel dropped, no one applauded. There was only the quiet recognition that something poisonous had finally been named, held accountable, and locked away. The town itself began to change, not immediately and not easily, but change came nonetheless. The scars didn't vanish, nor did the pain. Imani's funeral had planted something deep in the roots of the community, and what followed was more than reform. It was reckoning. New leadership replaced old, young voices, joined school boards and city councils, and a civilian oversight committee took permanent shape within the sheriff's department. Students repainted the mural outside Imani's classroom, adding new hands, black, brown, white, clasped together in silent solidarity, and beneath her portrait were etched the words, "She spoke first, and didn't stop. Justice had come, quietly, completely, and the man who delivered it had become exactly what the world needed him to be: a shadow with purpose, a name carried only in truth, a brother who never stopped listening to the voice that spoke first." I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.